Breaking news is coming from Washington. The United States of America is preparing a large-scale lifting of sanctions. And if you thought it was against Russia, fortunately it's not. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that additional United States sanctions against Venezuela could be lifted as early as this week to facilitate oil sales. He also mentioned that he will meet with the heads of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to discuss resuming cooperation with Venezuela. Let me remind you that these organizations have not worked with Venezuela for more than 2 decades. In fact, the United States wants to quickly put Venezuela on the path to economic prosperity. However, issues have emerged because American investors still lack confidence in Venezuela's prosperity. Major United States oil companies, even after meeting Donald Trump, remain reluctant to invest tens of billions in oil and gas. This could seriously disrupt Donald Trump's plans. My name is Alex Cipici. Let's discuss this complex topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. This really helps promote the content on YouTube, and I would be very grateful to you for that. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, the United States Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, announced a large-scale lifting of sanctions against Venezuela. He stated that nearly $5 billion United States dollars from the currently frozen International Monetary Fund special drawing rights of Venezuelan assets could be used to restore the country's economy. In other words, this money will be unfrozen and immediately injected into Venezuela's economy. First of all, the United States is lifting sanctions on the sale of Venezuelan oil. The United States Department of the Treasury has been studying changes that would allow the repatriation of revenue from oil sales, which is mainly stored on ships, back to Venezuela. Scott Bessent said that the main task now is to sell the Venezuelan oil that has already been extracted, most of which is probably already loaded onto tankers. But to do this in such a way that the money from its sale actually goes to the Venezuelan people and not to the remnants of Maduro's regime in Caracas. For this purpose, the United States is taking the money under its own control and will direct it to specific sectors of the economy themselves. And now Bessent announced that the sanctions will be lifted this week. Well, and as Reuters writes, quote, "These steps are part of the Trump administration's efforts to stabilize the situation in Venezuela and encourage the return of American oil companies to the country." A week after American-Venezuelan troops captured Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro in Caracas and brought him to New York to face charges of drug trafficking. And here I should remind you that United States sanctions have prohibited international banks and other creditors from interacting with the Venezuelan government without the appropriate license. These institutions called this an obstacle to the complex restructuring of $150 billion in debt, which is believed to be a key factor in bringing private capital back to Venezuela. Now they must handle Venezuela's debts too. On Friday evening, President Donald Trump signed an order prohibiting courts or creditors from seizing revenues from Venezuelan oil held in United States Treasury accounts. He stated that these funds must be protected to help Venezuela build peace, prosperity, and stability. This is an important point, and I will elaborate on it. The thing is, Nicolas Maduro's regime doesn't just owe creditors like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Maduro's regime owes tens of billions of dollars in compensation to those oil companies that once invested in oil extraction in Venezuela. But then the regime nationalized all the oil infrastructure and promised to pay compensation to these companies, but never did. There is a class action lawsuit in a United States court for more than $20 billion in compensation. And then suddenly, Trump seizes up to 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela and plans to sell them. The money from selling this oil must first go into American accounts and from there be redirected to Venezuela. That's what they think in Washington. It will be safer this way. But here's the problem. When the money from selling Venezuelan oil enters accounts in the United States of America, an American court can immediately order these funds to be confiscated in favor of creditors, in favor of oil companies, in favor of those who once invested in Venezuela and are waiting for some kind of compensation. The court can do this, say, listen, the money has arrived, we are confiscating it right away and redirecting it. And that would be fair, to be honest. Donald Trump declared a state of emergency in the energy sector and banned dividing the funds. Here are Venezuelan oil sales. Like, first we'll restore Venezuela, and then we'll be able to get not just money, or rather debts from it, but also some profit. It's a hint that we're restoring things now, not splitting them up and we'll recover everything later, but Washington isn't stopping. Scott Bessent, who holds the largest United States share in the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, said both organizations have already contacted him about Venezuela. The head of the United States Treasury stated that the Treasury is ready to convert Venezuela's special drawing rights held in the International Monetary Fund into dollars for use in Venezuela's reconstruction. Currently, Venezuela has about 5 billion special drawing rights, but at the moment does not have access to them. They are frozen, and now Bessent is asking to unfreeze these funds under the guarantee of the United States of America. Let me explain a bit here again. Last year, the United States Treasury Department agreed to support a swap line for Argentina in the amount of $20 billion, partially using the special drawing rights of this South American country, in an attempt to stabilize the peso and help the party of Argentina's President Javier Milei win the parliamentary elections. And by the way, they succeeded. Milei won back then, everything was great. So did this scheme work? And now, Bessent is basically suggesting to do the same thing with Venezuela. Let me remind you, the International Monetary Fund hasn't interacted with Venezuela for more than 2 decades. The last official assessment of Venezuela's economy conducted by the International Monetary Fund was completed in 2004, and since then the International Monetary Fund hasn't gotten involved there at all. Venezuela paid off its last World Bank loan in 2007 when Maduro's predecessor, the late Hugo Chavez, stated that Venezuela, quote, would no longer have to turn to Washington for financing. And that's when he nationalized many companies, and things took off from there. At the same time, the World Bank stated that it was in the early stages of exploring how it could help Venezuela, noting that the bank quickly provided assistance to Afghanistan and Syria after regime changes and gave early support to Gaza and Ukraine. But that's not all. Bessent stated that, in his opinion, small private companies will return to Venezuela's oil sector very quickly, despite the reluctance expressed by some major oil companies, including ExxonMobil, whose assets in Venezuela have been nationalized twice. And now they're afraid to go back there. Quote, I think this will be a typical situation where private companies will be able to act quickly and enter the market very fast. They didn't talk about funding at all. Chevron has been present in this market for a long time and will continue to be there. That's why I believe their commitment to it will increase significantly. But here's the problem, because Bessent of course says all this with confidence. But on the eve, Donald Trump gathered the heads of the largest United States oil companies at the White House to convince them to invest their money in Venezuela. And Trump has even stated that he wants to raise $100 billion in investments in the Venezuelan oil sector from American companies. But after these negotiations, the largest United States oil and gas company, ExxonMobil, stated that they consider Venezuela unattractive for investment until the conditions for American business in that country change. And now I'll give you a quote from the corporation's chief executive officer, Darren Woods, verbatim. Our assets in Venezuela have already been confiscated twice, so, as you can imagine, some pretty serious changes would be needed for a third return. Reforms can only be implemented under the current United States administration, working hand in hand with the government of Venezuela. That's why the Americans have grand plans for Venezuela, and as we can see, they are really trying to restore the economy at a pretty fast pace, so that they can also profit from it later. I'll leave it at that, friends. If you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially with any donation. Use the links and payment details in the video description or scan the QR code on your screen. Thank you for any support. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.